Good morning. I'm Claire Kramer Mills from the New York Fed's Community Development Team, and it's my pleasure to kick off this Earth Month webinar. Earth Month may be coming to a close tomorrow, but it's fair to say that our national discussion about climate and communities is ramping up. Our Community Development Team at the New York Fed is focused on lifting up promising ideas and practices that could have transformative impact in reducing risk and expanding economic opportunity in underserved communities. That's why I'm so excited to listen to the experts we've gathered today, to learn what's working, why some promising models and practices get stuck, and what communities need most to adapt and build resilience in the face of climate change. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Javier Silva, who will moderate today's discussion.
Thanks so much, Claire. Good morning, everyone. I'm Javier Silva from the New York Fed's Community Development Team, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the panel of experts for the conversation. Peggy Shepard, Executive Director and founder of We Act for Environmental Justice. Caleb Stratton, Chief Resiliency Officer for the City of Hoboken in New Jersey. Daphne Rose Sanchez, Executive Director of Kinetic Communities Consulting. Kim Waddell, Project Lead for a FEMA-funded Hazard Mitigation and Resilience Plan update for the U.S. Virgin Islands. And Jorge Gaskins, Director of Community Relationships with Barrio Electrico, which is based in Puerto Rico. Before I continue, let me note that the views I express today are my own and do not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System. Today's discussion is going to focus on climate resiliency and climate adaptation in communities on the front lines of climate change. We have a panel of experts who have engaged with communities over many years on mitigating climate-related risk, while also addressing issues of investment equity and green technology. The panelists have thought for quite some time on how to grapple with climate change in low-income and underserved communities. I'm very excited to have all of you here today. So here's how the panel will go. We'll begin with a few questions for each of the experts, then open the discussion to everyone. Members of the audience can submit questions throughout the discussion by entering them into the chat box. As questions come in, we'll synthesize and consolidate them for the panelists. First, I want to thank all the panelists in advance for joining us today. Let's begin with Peggy Shepard. As climate resiliency and adaptation take center stage, community development advocates and practitioners on the front lines of climate change are working communities that stand to be the most impacted. Peggy, you founded We Act for Environmental Justice in 1988, and you have fought tirelessly during this time to ensure that the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment extends to all. You served on various advisory councils and was recently named co-chair of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And continuing your national advisory role, last week you addressed President Biden's Leadership Summit on Climate. What motivated you to start We Act, and what was the tipping point that you saw in the community?
Well, what motivated me to start We Act was that I was running to be Democratic district leader in West Harlem when one of the volunteers to my campaign said that there was a sewage treatment plant being constructed and about to open in the Hudson River at 138th Street on the west side of Manhattan, and would I get people jobs there? And so at first, I thought it was a job situation, and actually I was able to get about 30 people hired. But a few months later, the plant began operating and spewing odors and emissions that were making people sick. So I began with the community 6-year organizing campaign under the Mayor Koch administration. That was not a friendly administration to uptown neighborhoods. And to make a long story short, we got 100 people coming out every month for 6 years to hold the city accountable. Once Koch was out of office and we had the political moment, because so many of these large infrastructure projects really depend on the political moment, the political will. And when David Dinkins became, who was the first Black mayor of New York City, when he became mayor, he said, there's a problem here and we're going to fix it. And so he committed $55 million to fix the plant. And I worked with the Natural Resources Defense Council, NRDC, as our attorney. We sued the city to ensure that we had a court mandate for what should happen at this plant. And we got $1 million settlement of our suit against the city, and that formed a foundation for community benefits that we use to really support community initiatives in West Harlem. So it was really community residents coming to me. It was also the fact that I had been involved in prior political campaigns in New York City and had the opportunity to see the difference in benefits in different communities and the different level of advocacy that helped bring those benefits. And so when I was running in West Harlem, I understood that without that kind of advocacy in our community, we would continue to be a dumping ground and we would not get the benefits that were accruing to other communities.
Thank you. You're alluding to a lot of issues that we're still grappling with even today. And so as we fast forward to today, the climate effects, the effects of climate change are already being felt not only around the world, but also locally. What is the most pressing time-sensitive issues that WEACT is addressing now in New York City?
I'd say the most time-sensitive issue, because we're addressing a number of climate change policies, but the most pressing is extreme heat, because we know that that will happen every summer and spring. And we also know that over the years, the temperatures have been increasing in New York City, as well as in other cities around the country. We also know that over 50% of all deaths from extreme heat are African Americans, even though the African American population is only 18% of all New Yorkers. So again, working with the city on the cooling centers, which to me is not the answer, but it's currently what we've got to deal with. And so we're working with them to make that situation more robust, and so that people know where these centers are. And we're working with the city's extreme, I think it's called the Urban Heat Island Task Force, again, to move policy. And I think one thing we've been doing is advocating at the state and federal level for more funds through the LIHEAP program, because most of those funds, at least in the New York area, go for heating. And we believe that there needs to be more distribution of those funds now for cooling. And there's some scientists that say that air conditioning actually is a prescription for certain people that is needed. And of course, we know that less than 50% of everyone in public housing in this city have an air conditioner. So extreme heat is very important. And of course, all of the issues of reducing our emissions from buildings through Local Law 97, working on statewide campaigns around electrification. Again, that's a goal of the state and city climate plans. How do we get there by 70 or 80% reduction by 2030, and then net zero emissions by 2050? How do we get there? And certainly electrification, a gas ban, which we're working on, and building emission reductions are key parts of that.
Thank you, Becky. This is really interesting, because the extreme heat in these communities is a serious issue. Let me turn now to Daphne, who's working across a lot of these communities. Daphne Rose of Kinetic Communities. You founded Kinetic Communities Consulting, which is registered as a social enterprise benefit corporation. Your firm helps to simplify energy efficiency opportunities for underserved New Yorkers. You advocate for and implement strategic energy equity market transformations. Daphne, what motivated you to start Kinetic Communities?
Thank you, Javier, and nice to be here with you all. So for me, what motivated me was a two-pronged thing. I am a born and raised New Yorker. I was born and raised in public housing. My family has been in public housing for many generations. And one of the things that I had always realized is that there was a weird correlation with who we are and where we live. right before we were even born and walking on this planet. And I realized that at a very young age, and I didn't really understand the complexity of the built environment and what my life is supposed to be just because of where I lived. And so I started studying more about what is the built environment, what is the relationship to our communities, how can it be better, why is it that public housing in NYCHA has been severely disinvested in and severely under maintained throughout the decades. And so as I was studying this, my family was also working very hard to own a home. And my parents were the first people in my entire family that has been living in New York for generations to buy a home. And they bought a home in Staten Island. And so it was a moment of joy for everyone because it was the first people to quote unquote get out of the hood, right? That they were able to buy a home, they were able to leave public housing, they were able to achieve the idealism of an American dream. But what really happened was that in less than a year, Hurricane Sandy struck. My family and I were all in the house when it happened. We were completely surrounded by water. We were waiting on the roof to get rescued, and we got rescued by boat 8 hours after the hurricane happened. And I remember sitting on the roof thinking to myself, like, we should have just stayed in public housing. Like, we should have stayed with the moldy walls and and the broken kitchen. Why did we buy a home? Like, that was like the first reaction that I had because I'm like, we bought a home and now we're gonna die. Like, this is a punishment. Um, and then the second reaction that I had, and my mom was just like trying to calm me down, and I laugh about it now because as a young emerging professional, I was like studying sustainability and studying the built environment. And then Hurricane Sandy happens and there's water all around. And I'm like, Mom, that's it. Like, we're going to die. Like, this is it. Life is over. Life is meaningless. Why did I study this? I can't even help us. And my father's Puerto Rican and my mother's Costa Rican. My mother was born in Greenpoint Hospital, which no longer exists. And she spent some time in Costa Rica. So she knew it was flood water. So she's like, Daphne, relax. Like, you're going to be okay. We're going to survive this. We just need to stay calm. And um, and what I kept telling her, I was like, Mom, have you ever seen these movies? It's always the first wave, and then the second wave comes and just takes the family away. So definitely not the appropriate reaction to a climate disaster. And we were quarantined on the island. Like, people were not allowed to go in and out of Staten Island. And I remember just sitting on Highland Boulevard, which is where the rescuers left us, and thinking, well, what I studied about sustainability and housing is useless. Why did this happen? I couldn't even help my own family. And I took about 2 months before I went back to my school because I was just so traumatized of like seeing water. um, I started talking to some of my professors and saying, hey, we lost everything. A lot of other families had lost everything. There's a lot of immigrant communities, monolingual, Central American and South American communities in the area in Staten Island that we lived in. And then we started talking and talking, saying, well, why don't we provide them with some services from simple structural engineering, feasibility assessments, and translation services? And I was like, yes, I can translate, and then you guys as professional engineers can provide the structural analysis. And it was at that moment helping, completely selfish, right? Helping my family and helping other families in Staten Island, that I realized there's a delicate balance of social services and technical services that is required in the built environment market. And when I did some more research, I realized that the public housing that I was born in and the ones my father was born in, my grandmother, they were all in red line areas. And the only area that my mother and my father were able to purchase a home was a red line area in Staten Island. And that was huge to me. So I continued working in the intersection of sustainability and housing, and I started Kinetic Community Consulting, which is, as you mentioned, a minority woman benefit corporation that's focused on strategic market transformations. We are a benefit corp, and we are a tech neutral corp. And so what a benefit corp is, it's a for-profit institution that is mindful of community, employee, and environmental impacts that we're having. So we are looking at both what are the external projects that we're doing and how are we engaging the community and uplifting them and providing restorative means for workforce, for their infrastructure, as well as how are we internally engaging our community, how are we treating our employees, how are we partnering with local minority businesses, where is our dollars going to as well. And so that's why I really like being a B Corp. And it's been a journey ever since. I've had the pleasure to partner with a lot of the environmental justice organizations in the city and utility in helping design and implement equitable energy efficiency programming and policies.
Want to make sure I'm not on mute here. No, that's great, Daphne. Let me switch the conversation over to Caleb in Hoboken. Caleb, you're the Chief Resiliency Officer for the City of Hoboken, where among many responsibilities, you're managing the implementation of the $230 million Rebuild by Design Hudson River Flood Risk Reduction Project. So, I mean, you know, Hoboken is making sizable investments to fortify its physical infrastructure. As you can see, you know, when the infrastructure is not, we saw during Superstorm Sandy, when it's not strong, well, what can happen? Can you discuss what that entails and the approach Hoboken has taken in this process?
Absolutely. And thank you for the invitation to speak today. Listening to Daphne's story made me think about my story a little bit. And so I was also in school studying sustainability. And when I moved to Hoboken, I moved into the floodplain and I didn't know it. I was in 2011 when Hurricane Irene occurred. And then the following year, Hurricane Sandy occurred. We were still in the same apartment and flooded. And at that point in time, my entire professional focus shifted. I was at school at CCNY in Harlem at the Spitzer School of Architecture, and I was studying under Tony Griffin, who ran the J. Max Bond Center, who was powerhouse. I see Peggy nodding her head. And I realized that not just myself, I was completely uninformed about the floodplain in Hoboken. 75% of the city of Hoboken's in the coastal floodplain, and about 80% of our residents are in the coastal floodplain. Sure, in Staten Island, many of the people living in the floodplain did not know that. They were not informed. It was not part of a disclosure notice when they were purchasing their property. And so redlining was what occurred when basically communities of color were displaced, or it's a complicated urban issue, but it focused vulnerability into specific areas. And you have Hoboken specifically, our housing authority was built in the lowest point of the floodplain. So, and that's consistent with what occurred in New York City and NYCHA and all these other places. And so it placed vulnerable, more vulnerability unnecessarily, and it aggregated it. And so when Hoboken, after Hurricane Sandy, was looking at the issues of how to adapt and respond, the urban environment is not well suited to elevating individual structures or migrating areas out of flood risk. So we participated in a process called Rebuild by Design, which Staten Island did also. So they have a project that's offshore to dissipate wave action. So Staten Island had a lot of from Hurricane Sandy that was related to basically there was nothing between the Atlantic Ocean within the New York Bight to dissipate wave action. So they looked at an ecological response to building oyster reefs, which lowers wave action and reduces flood risk in some of the more vulnerable areas of the coast. But in Hoboken, we looked at our vulnerable populations and decided that approaching flood risk reduction comprehensively meant to do physical structures that were closer to our bulkheads and the water's edge, through seawalls, levees, gates, to reduce flood risk from coastal storm surge events, but also recognizing that we needed to reduce risk from rainfall-related flood events for the western side of the city, specifically more of our vulnerable populations, because rainfall events, which are categorized by 100 Resilient Cities as a stressor. So being a chief resilience officer, I'm responsible for adapting infrastructure to action uncertainties of climate change. And to do that, we use labels. So stressors are events that occur frequently that are less severe. So for example, extreme heat is a stressor, whereas a hurricane would be a shock. Shock being something that is less frequent, but much more consequential. And I'm sure I had the pleasure of meeting Jorge earlier this week, and he's going to talk about some of what the impacts of those shocks or stressors might be in Puerto Rico. But by labeling them, we can begin to develop adaptation to the different impacts we have, also correlate the investment to the frequency or intensity of those events that occur in the city. So we also developed a stormwater management protocol and implement projects to make sure that we're not just improving or reducing the likelihood of future very consequential events, but addressing those kind of more frequent stressors that really affect quality of life. And that can be anything from where City of Hoboken's a combined sewer overflow community, and what that means is that rainwater and sewage mixes. And if we have sewer backups in our, or rainwater backups in our street, it's actually sewage. So if you see a tomato plant growing at the corner of a block in Hoboken, it's not because someone planted it there. That's a really big issue. And that's a really big issue that might not be something that people want to invest a lot of money in, but we were able to create compelling arguments to move the community in a direction that was both sustainable and resilient. So I'm really excited to hear from the other panelists, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about what we're working on. So thank you.
Yeah, Caleb, you mentioned the shocks and stressors. You know, with those shocks and stressors, you have recovery and rebuilding, you know, which may displace community residents and can also lead to gentrification in some instances. What are some strategies to help break this cycle?
I don't think that I'm a great expert to speak on that, because Hoboken has experienced gentrification over the last 30 years. And I think that it's difficult to say that we've done well in not displacing some residents. One of the things that we have done is we've invested quite a bit of time and energy into our rent control office, and we've also been very specific in development opportunities about 0% displacement for either residents of our housing authority, but we also have a number of other lower moderate income communities that are part of Section 8 program, which is different. We have a strategy that's related to veterans that we've done a number of projects building permanent housing and temporary housing for veteran communities. And then we have YMCA in the community that we are trying, use the right language, but we have almost 100, I think more now. It continues to grow through a partnership with the YMCA, but individuals that are either experiencing homelessness or trying to improve themselves from that condition, to give them non-permanent but non-temporary kind of a bridge between being not having a place to stay and having a place to stay, to kind of encourage people to stay in the community. So I don't think that we've done enough, but it's something that's really important to address.
Thank you, Caleb. Let's shift gears to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is part of the New York Fed's district. Ken, in your role at the University of Virgin Islands, you're the project lead for a FEMA-funded hazard mitigation and resilience plan update for the Virgin Islands. You've had a hand in many initiatives to help make the island much more resilient than it is. And, you know, as we all know, you know, in light of the hurricanes that struck the region in 2017, this work is even more pressing than ever. So what, you know, from where you sit, what actions are underway or planned to mitigate climate risk in the Virgin Islands?
Thank you, Javier. It's great to join everyone. here in the Virgin Islands, we are quite busy, as our colleagues over in Puerto Rico, for responding to the same storm. What we're doing here in the Virgin Islands, and I'll talk, throughout some of my comments about this hazard mitigation and resilience planning effort. But, most of these natural hazards, are exacerbated by climate change. So, as Caleb mentioned, the heavy rainfall events, these stressors that really cause a lot of coastal flooding. We see the same thing. All of our small towns, we don't really have cities throughout the Virgin Islands, but we have 3 towns where a sizable proportion of our population reside. And as well as most of our coastal communities, we're all vulnerable to flooding and heavy rain due to heavy rainfall. But we're also dealing with droughts. In fact, we just declared a drought condition here in the territory this past week. And then, of course, hurricanes. And then, obviously, sea level rise is another challenge because we are a set of islands. But specifically, we have, just drawing upon the drought example, we're working with USDA. We have a drought monitoring program. We've been monitoring drought, but not as carefully as we'd like or historically. And so more recently, we're able to declare droughts early so that we can assist or advise farmers, for example, to start, for example, collecting grasses or hay for their feed animals, but also for those who collect water through their roof into cisterns. Many of our homeowners throughout the territory have cisterns that are not connected to public water. So, and water is very expensive here, 8, 9, 10 cents a gallon if you get it delivered. So these are huge economic impacts for folks. We also are working with the Department of Interior as well as USDA again to develop strategies and resources for water storage. I mentioned the cisterns, but for really rural folks like farmers, having storage tanks and holding facilities and irrigation setups to help these farmers. So this is one area that we are putting a lot of energies, especially here in St. Thomas. And then we're working with the local government agency, our Department of Planning and Natural Resources, to develop adaptation strategies to improve, for example, drainage in our coastal towns. And this is really critical for sea level rise because, as you know, a lot of our towns are, while they're obviously right down to the water, there is some elevation to a number of the towns. And so the water drains out to the sea. But the drainage pipes are actually now underwater more often than not. And so there's backup of the seawater into our sewer systems. So, and then we also have we're working with NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. We have a new fellow who's going to be compiling and integrating climate data into adaptation strategies, again, for the territory. So those are just a handful of some of the specific activities in addition to what we're doing with the hazard mitigation and resilience plan.
Great. Thank you, Kim. And I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation a little bit more. Let's bring in Jorge. Jorge, finally, you're the Director of Community Relationships with Barrio Electrico in Puerto Rico. And in the aftermath of the hurricanes, Puerto Rico, as many people know, went without power for months, with some communities going without power well over 120 days. I mean, in response to all of this, you've been working with communities to make them more resilient by organizing solar cooperatives. Can you tell us a little bit more about this work?
Thank you, Javier, and thank you for the opportunity to share. It's listening to the experiences and of the other 4 panelists. It just seems like Puerto Rico is just one more on the list. Though we cultivate our own insular mentality to think that the world ends at our shores and everything that happens to Puerto Rico is unique in the world and couldn't be worse or couldn't be better, depending on what it is. But the fact is that we all share, and the hurricanes of September 2017, Maria, Irma, that affected the Virgin Islands, the Eastern Caribbean, and Puerto Rico was a double whammy, though it's not unique. I've lived through 7 major storms, major hurricanes, category 4 or 5 hurricanes in Puerto Rico in the last 30 or 40 years. We've never had 2 at once that crossed the island so dramatically, Irma to the north and Maria straight through the island. When the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico is in bankruptcy, and when particularly the electric power grid, our public utility PREPA, has been in bankruptcy and has not spent any money on maintenance or spare parts for the last 10 years perhaps. So we didn't recover like we recovered from George, like we recovered from Hugo. Our island resources were not enough. The entire grid was on the ground. Transmission, distribution, part of the generation. And you mentioned the 300,000 families in Puerto Rico, which is about 1/4 of the entire service area of PREPA, went between 120 and 180 days without any grid service. And the following 60 days was iffy at best. And we're still subject to periodic unexplained blackouts. I think most of the non-insular studies show that 60 people died as immediate effect of the storm, and 4,700 fell victim to the blackout and the conditions that were left in Puerto Rico afterwards. So this is sort of an AM, PM type of situation for Puerto Rico, before Maria and post Maria, that people start reviewing the tenets and the proposals and the reason of being for most of our community organizations, their interface with municipalities, which came through very well during the storm, and this almost perfect bad connection between the federal administration that was unresponsive and the local government that was incompetent, that left the people to be mostly up to their own devices. And from this neighbor to neighbor that had to help one another, Barrio Electrico was born. Having the grid on its knees or completely absent in a lot of our communities meant that this was a time to talk about other means of electric power generation. Solar energy is well known, and it's well known on the island beforehand. Solar energy with batteries was sort of a new twist. But from a people that are left without power, the whole lexicon of Puerto Rican inhabitants switched to kilowatt hours. Everyone spoke in kilowatt hours. So Barrio Electrico had a niche if we could somehow unite the energy and the need of the communities with capital source and with technology. And this is what I was so interested with Daphne's comments, that it's a space between social services and technical services. It's a space between taking a technology, making it better, making it more adaptive to the specific needs of a region, and yet the social aspect of it to introduce in such a way that the families can adapt to it. Having a solar system on your roof can be just another roof ornament if you don't know what it's about. Charity of donating a solar system to a family. We're already seeing them stuck on roofs without any type of contact or connection with the people who live in that house. Barrio Electrico exists to try to get the community's educational level to the degree that a neighbor can walk through and even troubleshoot a solar system with another neighboring family. So that this leap to adopt another technology as your primary energy source is not a bridge too far. And that the adjustment that the family has to make to their own power consumption. Puerto Ricans are addicted to kilowatt hours in a terrible manner. The average Puerto Rican family consumes more kilowatt hours than a family in France, for example. And it just doesn't line up to our economic reality. And it doesn't have to line up. I mean, our economic reality is such that we can adapt better. We're adapting from places like the Virgin Islands, going back to rainfall harvest for water. This has almost been lost in Puerto Rico. And now we're trying to produce energy and a water source on each family level. But to Barrio Eléctrico, the key of this is the community organization.
Thank you, Jorge. This is really, really important work. You know, you mentioned Daphne's work, and I want to go back to Daphne. You know, you're working in the community with stakeholders, community members. What are some of the challenges that you face when you work in the community? You know, as we transition to a non-carbon future, and ensuring that this transition is equitable for all, especially in underserved and low-income communities. You know, what are some of the challenges that you see that we need to overcome in communities?
Thank you, Javier. And I would say there's a lot of challenges when society is doing a market transformation, right? We've seen society do it many times throughout its history. We've seen society do it when there's this new idealization of home ownership, this new idealization of the industrial period, and now we're in this new kind of market transformation of tech and technology. And so a lot of times when we hear conversations on climate action and climate solutions, and let's mobilize society to become more resilient and more sustainable, we only hear the conversation in terms of tech. We don't really understand how is the tech being implemented, what is the impacts, what are the pathways that it's going to be done. And so what tends to happen is there are large scale tech solutions that will be deployed, but there's no consumer support. There's no financial literacy. There's no mechanism to have a checks and balance to ensure that the technology and the organizations behind the tech are not utilizing predatory practices. And so a lot of times what we're doing with community members, specifically Black and Brown communities in New York City, is first educating them, educating them what is the technology, what is the good and bad of every single technology, what is the value for them if they're a renter or a homeowner or property manager, how can they, if they're a minority and women-owned businesses, what is the pathway for them to learn about the tech? How can they operate and maintain it within their community? What are some kind of legal ramifications of the different payment and financial products that are out there in the sector? And then we go to the second step, which is advocacy for those consumer protections. So ensuring that the financial agreements are not predatory, working with a lot of our partners to ensure that they have different pathways. A lot of times when we hear about solar and we hear about heat pumps, we're hearing about this 0% down lease option, because that way, you know, the city and the state and us as a society, we win because everyone gets solar, right? But it's ignoring the fact that people have homes that are highly inefficient, right? Because of, I spoke about how I was a NYCHA resident. What's behind me here is a NYCHA apartment. But there has been years of disinvestment, right? Years of the federal government ignoring it. And us as a society, we have this afang, this desire, this love to like build something new and then disappear and like forget about the whole operation maintenance. And so in New York City, 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions comes from existing buildings, and 90% of those buildings will still be here in 2050. And so when we're talking about new technology, we can't just slap on the new technology onto these buildings because they have a really high load, right? You have a whole myriad of health stuff that you have to fix. You have air leakage. You have an inefficient HVAC system, an inefficient heating distribution system. And so if you're smacking on solar and you're smacking on heat pumps, and you're ignoring the inefficiencies, you're actually oversizing the new technology and you're paying more for the technology than what you should be paying. And so what we recommend folks to always do is to reduce their load and make sure that they have the most efficient lighting, the most efficient HVAC system, the most efficient heating distribution system, because a lot of our buildings are in steam. And in reality, we have to decommission, we have to get rid of the steam system, and we have to make sure that the buildings have hot water systems, because the technology will be there to, especially the heat pumps, to connect to a hot water system in the future. And then lastly, once you reduce the load, incorporate solar and incorporate heat pumps. And so making sure that the way that they're planning those capital projects are mindful of what is the financial capacity of that homeowner, of that property manager, and being mindful of where the technology is at today, right? Because we don't want a situation where a low-income homeowner, first-time home buyer, goes and installs a system, and then 5 years down the line, they have to take it out, and and because there's a newer, more efficient system. And so even though they haven't seen the return on investment, they're going to have to swap it out. And so we emphasize that Kinetic Communities is a tech neutral firm, because we're not against tech. We're actually very pro tech, but we want to make sure that the social aspect of it, the economical aspect of it, is properly integrated with the tech aspect. Because if it's not, then what's going to happen in 20, 30 years down the line in the future, when we're all kind of saying, yay, we have solar everywhere, yay, we have, all electric everything, there's going to be a myriad of people that are coming out with a lot of consumer protection issues, a lot of lenders that are completely unregulated in the energy market, doing predatory practices, incorporating predatory interest loans, and then we're going to have this whole new slew of issues, right? And so we want to we're kind of talking about the things that no one likes to talk about because it hinders deployment, but we want to make sure that when it is deployed, and it's deployed in a way that is restorative. So using the example of NYCHA, we need the federal government to give money to NYCHA so that they can restore their buildings back to a healthy place to live. And then once they restore the buildings and they convert their HVAC system, incorporate the solar and incorporate the heat pumps, which they are doing at the same time. And we act and Kinetic Communities and a couple of other organizations are working with NYCHA on deploying community solar. So it's important for us to understand that, yes, we need to incorporate renewables. Yes, we need to do electrification, but we need to do it in a way that is looking holistically at the people that are within the built environment.
Thank you, Daphne. So yeah, this issue, as we're planning the transition to clean energy, we have to make sure that the transition is equitable and affordable for everyone. And you raised really important issues. There's the workforce issue, but now consumer protection issue as well. Let me turn to Peggy here. What needs to happen over the next 1 to 5 years in order to move the needle forward on this equitable transition for all?
Yeah, so in terms of what we've been doing, several years ago, we organized about 400 community residents in East, West, Central Harlem, Washington Heights, Inwood, to develop a Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan. And this came about right after Hurricane Sandy. And the primary issue that the community was engaged in was energy justice. And so as a result of the community identifying that priority, we are a membership-based organization, I should mention, we decided to focus on solar installation. So we've probably trained about 1,000 people in solar installation. We have focused on installing solar on rooftops of HDFCs, which are low-income tenant-owned cooperatives. We have many of them in uptown neighborhoods, and we feel that that is a way to fight gentrification by keeping housing affordable. And one way to do that is to keep energy affordable. And so we have done solar installations on 17 HDFCs. As a result of not being able to get a lot of Black and Latinos hired by the unions. We had 12 of our trainees start their own solar cooperative called SUN, Solar Uptown Now. And they've just finished doing a 7-acre solar array upstate. They are incorporated. We're incubating them. We got them trained through the Green Worker Cooperative in the Bronx that's run by Omar Freya. And they are now applying for status as an MBE as well. And it's a great success story. And I think as we transition from a fossil fuel economy to a clean energy future, we're going to have to find different ways of worker associations because they will not, at least in a city like New York, be welcomed into the construction trades. So we really see worker cooperatives as a wave of the future. We're also part of a statewide coalition called Better Buildings New York, looking at policy issues of electrification. And as a part of that, we have a pilot study called Out of Gas. And we're looking at 20 units in New York City and 20 in Buffalo, working with Push Buffalo up there to swap out gas stoves and swap in induction stoves and heat pumps. And so we are now working with housing in a housing developer in the Bronx, which is in a NYCHA development. And we're going to be developing that pilot there. We also assume, and part of the study is doing the air monitoring. We're working with Berkeley Air to do the air monitoring before and after, because we know that gas stoves create an incredible amount of indoor air pollution, up to 10 times more than outdoor pollution. And that's been documented in a Rocky Mountain Institute, a study that came out last fall. So really beginning to, through our pilot, to inform electrification policy, because we know that in terms of new construction, there's laws there that will mean that new buildings have to comply with local law 97. But for the retrofits, that's where we're really seeing the issues. Many buildings are not up to the electrical standard that's needed. And so again, being able to look at this pilot so that we can develop the kinds of policies we need to support the most vulnerable communities and to support lower revenue buildings is going to be very important. And so we're also working in a smaller coalition around a gas ban so that we can again begin to phase out gas to electric. We're also working with Con Edison and NYSERDA in East Harlem. We've just put up solar panels on the Wagner houses, and we're now recruiting residents into a community shared solar project as well. So those are some of the things that we're doing that we hope will come to fruition over the next 5 years, working in the Northern Manhattan community, but also focused on how we derive those learnings and that experience to drive better policy.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you. So we have about 9 minutes left, so I want to make sure I bring everyone in and for a few final thoughts before we wrap up. We will go right to noon. So let me direct this to Caleb and Kim. What would you like to see over the next 5 years, say, in the work that you're doing? What do you think will make a difference in terms of either funding, policy, or community practices to make sure that this transition to a non-carbon economy is equitable, to make sure that these stressors, when they do take place, don't severely impact underserved communities and low-income communities? What would you like to see? Let's start with Kim. Or
I was going to defer to the doctor here because.
Go ahead, Kim.
Well, no, I think in the Virgin Islands, I mean, we're seeing a lot of these same issues around the built environment, the infrastructure. I think our biggest challenge in the territory, we're at the end of the supply chain. So all of equipment, technology, all of that is probably a third or half is more, half again is more expensive than what you see on the mainland. We only have 100,000 people. And so our technical capacity to maintain even our existing infrastructure, much less our future infrastructure. So working at the university, I'm particularly interested in this workforce development. This is part of some of the other aspects of my job here in the territory, is to develop workforce for the future. And my colleague Greg Winnell, who works on Caribbean Green Technology Center, he's looking at these renewables and clean energy. And together, we have to cobble together something. But right now, we are really strapped financially because of COVID and other economic impacts over the last decade or so. And so the government is really constrained in what they can do. And this includes, hiring people. We have thousands of vacancies in our government, our public sector. And it's hard for private sector companies to hire people. We're an expensive place to live. There's a lot of challenges of living in the territory. So some of these things are really fundamental. And so when I look ahead, I'm excited with the potential of, working with communities, engaging communities and what have you, also adopting new, cleaner technologies. But we really have to build a foundation of understanding how our systems, whether it's for the built environment, communities, how they work, how they can function, and how we maintain them. I think that's the biggest challenge. How do we maintain the infrastructure through these episodic events like hurricanes, as well as these chronic events like climate change? And that's our biggest task, is to build that capacity, address those needs, and bit by bit, improve the efficiency of the systems that we rely on for the quality of our lives in the territory. And I suspect a lot of these same issues occur in Puerto Rico, as well as many other small island nations.
So I'll hop right in because I want to make sure that Jorge gets some time to speak here. One of the approaches we're doing is we're building a municipal microgrid, and that project is going to marry the ability to do demand response through non-carbon hydrogen-based fuel cell, so that during emergency event you have a resource that can power critical facilities, and then in a non-emergency event you have something that can be competitive with the grid that also addresses these uniquely urban issues of electrification and constraints on the existing basically power system. And we've received support from Rocky Mountain Institute and Board of Public Utilities and Peggy. I had an opportunity to work with your late colleague Cecil on a project and work with WEACT. And so there are, I think, opportunities to basically needing to aggregate demand so that you can achieve cost efficiencies. So that's one of the ways that we're physically doing that, is through something that's parallel to our existing grid service power. The other thing that I think that there's a tremendous opportunity is power purchase agreements and community aggregation programs. So you can do residential opt-out programs, which is looking at aggregating load in a specific area to be more competitive in how you bulk purchases for energy, specifically going out to bid to incorporate a higher percentage of renewables within the energy profile for consumption. Opt-out programs mean that everyone's in unless you say, no, I don't want to do this, and you try to do competitive pricing against the traditional energy profile. I think that there is going to be, needs to be more research and more understanding of how that information can get to individuals that haven't been educated on what's occurring in markets, because the cheapest prices will be first negotiated with the individuals that are aware of it and get to the table first, which traditionally leaves out underserved communities that may not be aware that there are these resources available to them to negotiate for energy prices, increase renewables. So that's the big thing to track is how do we connect populations with the information to understand that they can aggregate and coalesce around an idea of fighting for these resources up front, and making sure when big wind does come together for the East Coast, that it is first offered to the communities that will benefit most from decarbonization of our energy grid, which are commonly urban areas, that because it has something to do with how energy is produced and air quality and all those other things. So,
Thank you, Caleb. Let me turn to Jorge. We're almost out of time here, but I want to make sure I get back to you. Where are you in the process that you're undertaking with communities right now? Where are you in the process with the community? Is your challenge there financing of the work that you're doing? Is it organizing the community? What's your biggest challenge here in reaching out to the community and working with communities down in Puerto Rico?
Barrio Electrico has unleashed pent-up demand for residential solar, distributed solar with batteries. We have no lack of interest in the communities and with low and middle income families that went for so long without the grid. There's a great incentive in everyone's memory to look for resilience. Our problem is financing. As billions of dollars flow in from the federal government into Puerto Rico to build the grid back, distributed solar is slowly finding our voice to say we want it built back in renewables. We want it to be built back with more community input, more community resilience. We want more rooftop solar, less emphasis on solar farms that occupy our scarce agricultural land. We have enough rooftops to handle it. If these individual installations are slowly melded into community grids, then we could talk on a utility scale and talk about diversifying the overall grid in Puerto Rico. Storage will have a big part to play for that future. But the value proposition of Barrio Electrico is for a lower middle income family to put solar and batteries on top of their roof as a primary energy source, using the grid as a secondary source, and paying virtually what they're paying now for their electric power bill on a monthly basis. And this we can do through 10 or 20-year leases as long as we have access to cheap money. We use the credit unions, we use USDA guarantees, the REAP program, and we have a strong start on that. We use ITC equity capital, but we need long-term public access, be it through HUD, CDBG money, be it through FEMA, be it through some of the municipalities being willing to divert its resilience funds into rooftop solar for their communities. The grid is considered a social investment. We want the community-based rooftop distributed solar energy to also be considered a social investment.
Thank you, George. So I see that we're just a minute past 12. I'm going to close it out, but before I do, I want to ask each of the panelists to just give one final thought. I hope the audience can stay on for just 2 or 3 more minutes, and then we'll close it out. So let me start with Caleb, since you're right next, your box is right next to me, and just help us close it out. If you can keep it short, because I don't want to be too long, but I do want to give everyone a final word. So please, Caleb, go ahead.
I just think the importance of stressing building networks of neighbors and investing in relationships and building a sense of community is that first bridge into resiliency.
Ken?
Yes, thanks. I think education, I mean, a number of us have talked about having communities understand, the systems that operate to support their lives, their livelihoods, I think is important. But it's also understanding the choices that you have, in whether it's at that personal or family level. And then I think finally, as we think about climate change, education, what we saw in the past is not connected to what we'll see in the future. And so I think it's important that we're trying to educate people to understand that, the intensity of whether it's hurricanes or droughts or what have you moving forward, it's going to be more challenging in the future. And that's hard to get in people's minds.
Thank you. Daphne?
Yeah, I would just say for folks that are lending, thinking about the Community Reinvestment Act and how can we utilize something like that in the clean energy market can be important. In New York, we have something called the Climate and Community Investment Act that is being advocated by a lot of our environmental justice organizations. And I encourage you all to look at that online at CCIA, as well as other lenders that are interested in learning more about technology. We're happy to kind of help you figure out the New York City landscape. And most importantly, engage the community and make sure that it is their solutions that we're moving forward and doing it in a restorative manner.
Thank you. Jorge?
Yes, I think it's sort of holistic, in my view. It's encased in political will to get something else new done, but it involves the building practices, it involves the technology, and it involves the education of the communities to accept it. So it's not only one front we're fighting. We're fighting resilience on all fronts.
Thank you, Jorge. And Peggy, let me ask you to close it out, please.
Sure. Well, I would make a plea for supportive community organizing. Community organizing and training those community folks to tell their story, to brief and educate their elected officials, and to help develop the policies that we need. I can't, I just can't stress enough the lack of community organizing in the East, on the East Coast, that you have all over the South and in California. And we've got to organize folks. I've got to train them to give them the information that will really support the policies and the elected officials who we need to move forward progressively on these issues.
Well,
So
thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Peggy. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. I'd like to thank the audience for tuning in, and everyone, please have a good afternoon. Thank you.